the word to Jeff. And then we would need to switch the screen share to Jeff to progress the introductory slides.
Thank you.
And this meeting is being recorded, as you might have noticed. So if you speak up, this is going to be shared online.
All right, I think we will get started. So thank you, everyone. I think this is one of the first sessions of the virtual plenary, 24th plenary for the Research Data Alliance. And this is a meeting that's been organised by the RDA Life Science Data Infrastructures Interest Group. And today we're going to talk about FAIRification process and how we can achieve fair digital assets and services in the life sciences and beyond. There is some collaborative notes for this session. If you either go to that URL, tinyurl.com RDA24-LCIG, or scan this QR code, you will get to that. Maybe Volmar, if you just want to pop it in the chat as well, that might be useful. Thank you. So feel free to add your name to the list of attendees in that document. I think I'll go to the next slide. Back to there. Is that in the chat?
I put the actual link to the notes there in the chat. So the tiny URL leads to the link that's now in the chat.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Volmar. So I'm going to keep this short. So if you're new to the RDA, welcome. If you're an old hand, welcome as well. So interest groups in the RDA, just to remind you, they serve really as an ongoing mechanism for communication, discussion and coordination amongst individuals that are both members of RDA or also outside RDA. And these are for groups with shared interests. So this particular interest group, the Life Science Data Infrastructures Interest Group, we formed it in 2022, and really it was to act as a bridge between the operators of life science data infrastructures all around the world and relevant RDA groups. So we aspire to have meaningful representation from diverse geographical regions, from North and South America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Oceania. I would say that we have to date have most collaboration from groups within Europe, North America, Africa, and Oceania. And I think I'll just say that since we formed 3 years ago, we've met probably at, I'd say, about 7 or 8 plenaries, and most of our discussions have been formed around how can we make data assets fair and interchangeable between different infrastructures that support the research data life cycle in life science. So today's aims and the agenda are here. So we've got an hour and a half today. We will, pretty soon after this, we'll just do a little bit of an icebreaker just to find out who's in the room and why you're interested in this session and what you hope to get out of it. But we're really aiming to try and use today to showcase some approaches to both adopting and implementing the FAIR data principles. And we're interested in real tangible examples that have either been explicitly designed to apply across a whole wide range of communities or have been shown to be able to generalizable across different disciplines, both within the biomolecular life sciences and also beyond. The aim of this session is really to start to have this discussion and then inform an ongoing discussion with the wider RDA community to identify opportunities for future work and collaborations. And what we would really like to get to is, get to a point where we can provide practical guidance for life science data infrastructure operators and others on how to design and implement processes to support fair data management practices. So myself and Volmar will give this brief introduction and the icebreaker, and then we'll move on to hear from Nicola Mulder and Vasilios Ioannidis. Sorry about that pronunciation. And that's going to be a joint presentation by Life Science Data Infrastructures across Africa and Europe. And we'll have 20 minutes for that. And so it'll be fairly short and also include a bit of Q&A in that. Then we're moving on for half an hour, 4 flash talks or 3 flash talks from Cesar, Keith and Simon about FAIR enabling products, processes and practices. And then really we just want to wrap up with a wide-ranging discussion. So we've got 30 minutes at the end. So opportunities for future collaborations and alignment. We find at these things, we often don't have time at the end to have the discussion. So I would just request if you are presenting, if you can try to keep on time, that would be really fantastic. We will still have time for Q&A and we will still have time for the general discussion. So as I said, if you can please add your name onto the collaborative notes. The aim here is that we will produce a short report that briefly covers all of these approaches presented today and opportunities for future collaborations. We'll do that after the session. We invite everyone here to participate in that if you want to. So please definitely add your name onto the attendee check-in so we can get in touch with you after. All right, so, oh, that's just come out of, oh, sorry about that. Looks like I clicked on the link.
This is the meeting notes. It's not bad to introduce them though, so.
I clicked on the link, I think. All right, so we have a bit of a Menti poll here. Again, I think maybe Volmar, if you can pop the link into the chat. If people want to scan the QR code as well with your phone, you can join. And I think I'm going to stop sharing and Volmar will start sharing his screen, which will show the actual poll. So yes. Last 10 seconds to get your phone out and scan that, and I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, and I can get the QR code up again if someone really would need that. So it seems we have, let's see, now you should see my window with the Mentimeter poll displayed. Is that correct?
You do, yeah.
Perfect. So I'll also pop up the QR code here if anyone didn't manage to join. The first question we have here is just something to get an idea of who's in the room and where you're connecting from. So if you would like to share that with us, that would be great to see that. I mean, we are a international community, and I think that the let's say the QR code and scanning that on your phone is a nice way to interacting with the Mentimeter poll. You can also get a Q&A through this Mentimeter link. So if you keep it up in a window on the side as we go through the different presentations, and then you can ask questions and we will be able to pop back into the Mentimeter to see, I mean, all of the questions that have been suggested. And apparently there's supposed to be a feature where you can vote on questions that other people in the audience have proposed as well. So I see there are few people from Australia and some people from all over the world, Europe. We have Africa, and I don't see anything from the United States yet, but maybe that's the time zone issue. So I think this time we requested a time zone that would work for Australia and Europe because of us as organizers being more easily available at those times. Maybe in the future we can follow up with something that covers the countries that are not represented here. So thank you for sharing. I think we're currently 27 people on the call. So not everyone has responded, but I'm not going to stick around on this slide for too long. So the next one here is to get an idea of where you position yourself in the research infrastructure landscape. So our interest group is on data infrastructure, specifically from the life sciences. But and this time I generalized the question for, I mean, data infrastructures in general. I mean, are you someone who often use it, someone working in support, or are you in a different role in this landscape? And then we get an idea of like who we have represented in the session, and where we could start the discussions perhaps, or if we need to include someone at a later stage. So we have a lot of people who support users of it. And I think that's often the case for these RDA sessions. Staffing its services, there might be some overlap here, but I think we have used this a few times before, so it's a nice barometer to see how people thought about the different roles during or across the different sessions. All right, so we have some responses, some maybe 60% of us have responded so far. I think this might be still a pretty kind of decent picture of who we are, given the popcorn effect. The responses are not really ticking in as quickly as before. So we have some representation on people who are actually involved in the research infrastructure, less so from researchers, and maybe not so much for funding. I see that someone wrote other. Maybe you can share in the chat what you mean by that, and then we can perhaps include something additional in the future. So thanks for that. And then the last question here is basically your expectations for this session. So what made you click on the link and add this to your agenda? And maybe we can use this a little bit to shape the discussions throughout the session. So I'm gonna leave this open for a while now, and then we're gonna move over to the first presentations by Nicola Mulder and Vasilios Ioannidis, giving a picture of some of the FAIRification process activities in the life sciences. So learning from others, I think that's one of the reasons why I am here for sure, and why we organize this session. So using some of our experiences that we think are at least attempting to be on the fourth line of how to do FAIR in the life sciences, and then getting some feedback from you and learning from the other speakers as well, and then perhaps initiating some new discussions in the RDA or outside the RDA or both, to really create some tangible and practical advice on how to work with this. Getting an overview, I've used the RDA a lot for that in the past, so I think this is a nice way of doing that. New developments in FAIR, I think there might be some new stuff. Many of it is somewhat mature though, and might be something you have seen before if you have been following the developments in FAIR, and sharing experiences. So I think this is a nice picture of what the expectations are. Love, learning, FAIR. Let's keep that as kind of a tagline for the continued discussions. I'm gonna move on to the next slide here, which is how to go FAIR and the state of the art in biomolecular sciences, which is the section that we're gonna have the first presentations on. And here, the questions that you type into the Mentimeter will hopefully be shown, and then we can follow up with a few of these questions after the presentations. And then after all of the presentations, we might be able to revisit some of the questions and bring that up for a wider discussion. And I'm really hoping that we're going to get the full 30 minutes that we had planned for. So I'm going to leave now the screen sharing to Nicola Mulder, or Nikki Mulder. So please go ahead and share your screen.
So hi, everyone. And I hope you can see my screen. So it's a pleasure to be involved in the session. I'm going to talk a bit about our experiences in FAIR through two different projects. So the first project is East Africa, East Africa, and this is the kind of the research infrastructure that I've been representing. East Africa is this big, was this big project that ran for 12 years to look at the genetic and environmental basis for diseases in Africa. So there were multiple different projects across multiple different African countries. And then H3BioNet is this Pan-African Bioinformatics network or infrastructure that was to support the H3 Africa projects and beyond. So at H3BioNet, we actually used FAIR in many different ways. So first of all, we were looking at the fairness of the data. This is an extremely valuable data set of over 100,000 participants, the biggest to date of African data sets. We wanted to make sure those data sets were fair. We wanted to make sure that anything we did in terms of software development was fair, and then, of course, training. And so I'll go through each of these components and how we worked on the FAIR side. So in terms of the H3 Africa data, we actually used the RDA indicators to determine whether our data sets were fair. So we were doing kind of an assessment of all our components, even though we were focused the whole time on being fair. And it was in fact at that point in the second round of funding, it was a requirement from the funder to be fair. And so we used these RDA indicators, which have these different kind of priority levels, so essential, important, or useful. And we made the data fair by making it, first of all, findable in a data and biospecimen catalog. So we put the metadata into a catalog so that anybody around the world could find this and then actually access the data. So the data sets were all in the European Genome Phenome Archive, and then the catalog allows you to find the data sets and then actually submit a request. We made sure, obviously, because these were in the EGA, they had stable identifiers, and we also mapped them to ontologies. One of the ontologies, of course, was the DUO, the data use ontology, which provides reuse information. So what are you allowed to reuse the data for? So we went through the FAIR indicators, and we determined that the fairness was pretty high, up to between 80 to 90%. Of course, this is all kind of how you interpret FAIR and the indicators. For the software and the workflows, we used this assessment tool developed by fairsoftware.eu, where you could actually, on GitHub, you could run your software information about the software to determine how fair your software or your workflows were. And so what we tried to do was make sure that obviously all the code was documented, so it was very easily reusable. The workflows were all put in Kaya.io or made available completely freely on GitHub. And then we had one of the things that this tool does is it requires a checklist, and we actually had our own software checklist to make sure that the software was as fair as possible. So that was how we assessed the workflows. And then for FAIR, so we've been working with the Alexa group and Goblet to they've developed a set of chapters about how to make training fair. And the last chapter is this checklist where you can go through the different components and determine how fair not only your training materials are, but how fair the training instance is. How easy is it to find information about a course, for example. So we mapped all our courses to bioschemas, and this is the course instance, materials, etc. And then all the materials are given a DOI, and they put on something called a Ziva Hub, which is basically our UCT's version of Figshare. So in all these different ways, we're trying to make sure that every single piece of the infrastructure was as fair as possible. And then we wanted to really be able to show how fair we are. And so we developed this sort of badging system. We looked around for badging systems, and the software does have one, but we couldn't find them for other kind of items. So we have this just a basic Excel spreadsheet where when you've been through those different indicators, you can then give yourself a score for the F, A, I, and R. And then we've got this little tool that then creates a little image to show how fair you are in each one of those components. And then you can change the icon depending on whether it's data or training. And then we've used those actually on our website to show, well, this is, these materials or this activity is, 60, 70, 80% fair. The other project that we've been looking at in terms of kind of assessing fairness, and I know some people don't like the word fairness, but I'm just using it here for simplicity, just to show, you know, the assessment of FAIR. So this project is DSI Africa. So this is harnessing data science for health innovation in Africa. It's a big consortium, another big consortium in Africa, where we have multiple different research hubs and research projects that are bringing together data sets across climate change, health, genomics and image data, etc., and using data science techniques to try and generate health benefits. So we've got multiple different data sets here. And again, one of the requirements of the project was to be as fair as possible. So I run the open data science platform for this project. And in this, we wanted to help the different projects to make their data sets fair. So we basically, once a year, we pull the data sets to the data access groups together, and we define the conditions for each of the data sets, for data sharing, for querying the data, and then reuse across the consortium and beyond. And then we used, the aim was to then apply FAIR principles. So we used, again, we used the FAIR Plus data maturity, kind of different levels. We got all the projects to map out in this sticky note kind of board, what is the level of maturity, what is the level of fairness, what is the level of querying and access is required to have good scientific value out of the data. So for each of the projects, they established and prioritized their FAIR goals based on these different levels. We identified needs for data aggregation and sharing. And then we've been able to track over the different data jamborees or their kind of increase in level of FAIR maturity. So one of the requirements, obviously, in terms of being able to access the data, so we know that FAIR doesn't mean completely open. It means finding information about where something is as open as possible, as as closed as necessary. And so we mapped all the conditions of these. So for each of the individual data sets, if there was consent, we mapped these to the data use ontology. And we used a number of these different tools, the FAIR Cookbook, the RDM Kit, and NIH FAIR data and resources. So we had obviously came across a number of challenges. Conducting FAIR assessments actually requires a bit of knowledge about what is fair and what do those components mean? What does it mean to be interoperable, especially when you're working with clinicians or biomedical researchers who are not really aware of ontologies or stable identifiers. So there's a bit of training involved. And of course, it takes time. So we really had to get these people in a room for a week to sit and work on their FAIR maturity models and making the data sets as fair as possible. The other thing we had, particularly in this consortium, was distinguishing between primary and secondary data, because primary data, they were all getting data sets from different places where they didn't necessarily have the control to be able to share those onwards. And then the secondary data that they've generated, they then had more control. So these are all being discussed and it all is being framed within the steering committee's data governance framework for the consortium. So then in order to get to the next level of maturity, we obviously needed to have this data as findable as possible. So we wanted to have an opportunity for them to submit metadata to a catalog to make the aim was obviously to make these data sets discoverable, transparent and accessible, and also to ease the kind of the management of this metadata. So we created a REDCap metadata catalog backend. So basically, when all these different data sets, all their metadata, we have a harmonization tool that's used that's based on large language models, and then they can upload their metadata into this catalog. Only the project can see the data, and then the data that comes into the catalog, into the REDCap catalog, this REDCap form automatically gets pulled by an API into a catalog. So this is the Alwazi catalog where you can look at all the data sets. And for each of the data sets, there's category, there's type, there's country, and then data use conditions. So what is it that they are allowed to use the data for? And then, so basically this is making it as findable as possible. And then from there, there's a handover to, we're working on the handover to then an access committee or the person who's able to provide access to the data sets. The other thing we're working on is assignment of DOIs to these data sets, so that there is some sort of stable identifier associated with them. And so in this way, we're basically working towards a fair maturity model for a fair maturity for all of these different projects. So those are just ways in which our projects have been using FAIR all the way from data. Obviously in this case, the focus was on data, but even in this consortium, everything we do in terms of training, we try to stick to FAIR, and then we try to do the FAIR assessment as well. So these are just some of the project members, and I'd like to hand over now to the next speaker.
Thank you, Nikki. And Vasilios, you're up. And I think your slides are already visible.
Okay, thank you. So my presentation will be about, well, one of the components that Nikki just mentioned right now. So the title is called Verification in Action, a Practical Journey Through the Verification Framework. And just to mention that this work is actually done under the umbrella of the Elixir, just like 10 seconds presentation of Elixir for those who are not familiar with it. Elixir is a network of 24 national nodes and with a hub, and altogether they are connecting more than 250 research institutes. And experts from this network actually contribute to activities run by 5 platforms, 18 communities, 12 focus groups. Now, Elixir is also participating in projects together with industry and academic partners beyond Elixir. This presentation now will cover some of the outcomes of the FAIR+ project that has contributed to Elixir's portfolio of services focusing on verification. So just a background about the FAIR+. So using IMI project data, FAIR+ project, which ended end of 2022, aimed at design, test, and refine verification tools and processes. That was the challenge. And so to do so, the idea was also to build different outcomes, and some of which are mentioned here. So some of the outcomes were the FAIR cookbook that was mentioned before, and also to change data management culture in general. But all the experience we would have, we acquired in doing this verification, that was knowledge that we would like to share across the different outcomes. And today we will concentrate really on the maturity model, the DSM, and the verification framework. So the verification framework is made out of 3 components. And the first one is the verification process. So the first phase is to define a goal. So when you want to start this verification journey, you want to define a goal. So what is a goal? In very brief, it has to do with the desired usability of the data. And basically, it's something that is currently not possible in the current state of the data. So it's something you would like to change to make it possible after the verification. The phase 2 is called the project examination, and this is really crucial and necessary. It's really to understand the data. So what kind of data do you have, how it is structured, the type of annotation, all this, but also about the data in more general, the data hosting, the licensing, and the teams who will do the verification. So what are the available resources and their expertise? And all this is really important to understand the data and to be able to set the goals. For instance, if you set a goal that is related to data hosting, so you would like to improve that, but this cannot be fulfilled if the data is not available to start with or not accessible. So this is actually seen in the project examination. The phase 3 is the actual iterative verification cycle, and it's composed of 3 steps or stages. The first one is the assessment. So before you start any work, you would like to see where you are in terms of FAIR. So you do this assessment, and we'll come a bit later on that. And then the second stage is the design. So during the design stage, you have concrete steps from the verification template, which we see here at the bottom, that are identified to achieve the verification goal identified for this particular cycle. And then these steps that you have identified in the design phase, they would form the verification work plan to be realized during the implementation phase. And once you have done this design and implementation, you will redo an assessment, and then you will keep on cycling until the last implementation has been performed. And then you would move to the phase 4, which would be the last assessment and post-verification review. And it's basically very important just to make sure. So it's a review against the goals to make sure and to verify whether the goals were achieved or not. So now we see the three components actually of the framework. We see the verification process, the verification template, and the work plan. So this is the same information, but just displayed differently. But also I added a link to the publication here because you will find a lot more data and a lot more details about these different components and how to use them. And also I put a link to Zenodo where you can have all the PDF, PNG, and SVG files versions of the different components if you want to use them for your work. Now, we mentioned about these FAIR levels and assessment and this kind of tools. So during these FAIR Plus projects, we also developed the FAIR dataset maturity assessment tools, because at the time we were not really, well, not say happy, but the tools that were accessible or available at the time were not okay for us. We needed something more. So we developed this DSM, which contains 5 levels of FAIR states, which Dike just mentioned before, and it defines the requirements that are needed to reach any specific level of FAIR. We'll see that in a minute. And all these requirements, so these requirements of these levels are grouped into 3 dimensions. So basically, this is what we have. We have these 5 levels of FAIR. Okay, so instead of talking about percentage of FAIR, here we took the other perspective saying, which level of FAIR did you reach? So obviously level 0 is like it's no FAIR. It's for single-use data. There's no real potential for reuse beyond the lifetime of the project. Now, this level 1, it's at the level of the data object. And let's say this level would be suitable or enough for publishing your data set. I have to outline that all the DSM is really focused on assessing a data set, research data sets. The level number 2 is really how you would do data exploration, consolidation, multiple analysis within the same project. So different data sets, but within the same project. And level 3 would be one level higher. It's really focused on reuse within the community level. So the same type of data. And level 4 will go up to the cross-study domain with data interoperability, data integration, and harmonization between different communities. And level 5, well, that's data governance, and it's hardly reached in our experience. It was hardly reached. Now I mentioned there were 3 dimensions, and these are the dimensions that we were looking at. So it's the first one is the content and context. So basically it's what is the value, what is reported in the data object, so the value of the data and the metadata, the content. The second dimension is the representation and format. It's how the data and metadata are represented, are structured. And then the first dimension has to deal with the capabilities of the hosting environment, which is provided to enable support of FAIR data. So that's about the DSM. So basically, when you do the assessment, at some point you said, okay, I would like to reach this level that would allow me to be at this community level and to reuse the data at the community level. And when you do the assessment, you may find yourself, or the data set may be in that stage here, where you would need to improve this content requirements that needs to be worked out and improved up to level 3. The same for representation and format, and probably also here for hosting. So the assessment, the DSM will guide you. So all the steps and the improvements you would need to do to reach the level you desire. Okay, so the verification framework, well, we already mentioned the verification process. Now we'll just have a closer look at the verification template and the verification work plan. So the verification template, basically the template categorizes common verification tasks and consists of 8 steps, which we can see here at the top, related to the 3 dimensions of the DSM. So the dimensions which are repeated here below. And all these tasks that you would see here below the 8 steps here actually came out based on the experience of verifying these different data sets, the different use cases we encountered during the project. And these are really recurring themes that we encountered. So it means that if we have new use cases, there would probably be updated or new version of the template. Now, this is the verification work plan. So as I mentioned at the beginning, so the design and implementation plan to achieve the goal here according to the project examination in phase 2. So first draft and future direction. So all this work that was done in FAIR+ was actually taken over, if we want, or at least the framework here by the Elixir interoperability platform. And the aim is really to start working with that and to improve this framework and to apply it into different contexts and to have new or other use cases. So we started, now we have a first version of this framework, which was actually tested during this the ECCB in September last year. And this framework was also tested not only in Elixir communities, but also in others. So we tested also that with DSI Africa and this LYZ workshop that we did. And some others. So it was also tested, well, last week actually at the BioIT World Conference. So the idea is to see how we can improve this framework and then also enhance this framework not only for data sets, but also for processes and workflows. And for that, we may need to have additional metrics or maybe other assessment tools to use for that. And also, we mentioned here the verification template. So how about a service? So how could we change the verification template to fit, to do the assessment for a service and to verify the service? And for that, we really need community input or research input and your also input to see how we can improve this verification framework. And that's it for me.
All right, thank you so much, Vasilios. Let's pop into the Q&A. I see 2 questions. So one of them is basically on that it would be useful to have access to training materials related to this. So I think there is some training materials that you could link to. So Nikki and Vasilios, if you could add that to the collaborative meeting notes or the chat, I think that would be great. I will also follow up once the meeting is closed with some training materials that we can share with those who have shared your contact details in the collaborative notes document. There was also a question about where the data is deposited, I mean, to make it fair. And I think, Nikki, you had on one of your slides, at least an indication on some of the places where things were being shared. So maybe you can start that question off. And while you're answering that, we could start preparing for the next line of speakers. So Cesar, you're next in the line. If you just pick up your slides and be ready to share.
Thanks for the question. So it depends on the data set. So we, for the East Africa, it was mostly human data sets. And so those are all in the EGA, but that was a requirement of the funder. For the DSI consortium, the data sets, some of the data sets are on EGA, the genomics data sets, but most of the data sets are actually kind of private health data sets, image data sets. And so they're not necessarily in a public repository. So sometimes people will just have them kind of in their own space, but then that's why we're getting DOI, so that at least if they are not in a public repository, they at least have some way to track them. So it very much depends on the data set type as to where one would deposit the data.
Maybe just to add on that, so in our experience, whatever you do, if you deposit your data in an archive or in a repository, that will tremendously improve the fairness of the data in any case, because this repository will take care of many of these fair indicators or requirements, whatever you call them, because of the design. So there will be these identifiers that Nikki, you just mentioned also, and all these searchable and metadata, because when you upload the data in the repositories, they ask you to provide all these descriptions and metadata. So, and it's really, if you can do that, it's really something that we would propose and push forward, because it kind of take over a lot of these FAIR questions.
Thank you for that. I think we can also perhaps collect some links to the repositories that we know about in the shared report after this meeting as well. So I think this is an interesting discussion, and repositories are a key in this, of course. So the next section is FAIR enabling products, processes and practices, and what are some promising approaches. So it's more or less a showcase of some interesting developments. And to kick it off, we have César Barnabé, who's talking about a process or approach to work with goal setting. So please go ahead.
Thanks, Omar. So good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm César Barnabé. I work for the Biosemantics Group at Leiden University Medical Center here in the Netherlands. And in this presentation, I will introduce you to GoPlan, which is a method for FAIRification planning via the identification and refinement of FAIRification objectives. So you might see some overlap with the previous presentation, but the method is more, this method is more focused on the identification of objectives and a bit of project examination phase. It is actually has some inspiration on the previous workflow framework presented. So Vasilius, I would be really happy if we could collaborate on this in the future. So GoPlan is based on the assumption that the FAIR principles can be realized in different ways depending on the FAIRification objectives. And to exemplify that, I will actually like to start with this cartoon that in which we have a fashion designer and a data scientist, and both are concerned that their model is not fit enough for today's job. So here in this cartoon, you can really see that their interpretation of words such as model, fit, and the job are very different based on based on the context and their own objectives. So we can see that the fashion designer sees the word model as a person modeling the outfit, and she's worried that this person is not in shape physically or emotionally to perform the runaway today. And while the data scientist is more concerned that the machine learning model doesn't generalize well to the data, it might be overfitting and underperforming, or yeah. So this different way to interpret things based on goals has already been observed by the literature on FAIR. And for example, in the paper FAIR Principles, Interpretation and Implementation Considerations, the authors mentioned that any interpretation or implementation of the FAIR Principles may be chosen as long as they lead to machine actionable results. But while this freedom of choice may have contributed to the rapid, widespread adoption of the principles, it also has brought the risk of incompatible solutions between stakeholders' communities. And the paper that describes GoPlan, we also noticed that we also mentioned that neither the FAIR principles or the FAIRification workflows mandate the use of a specific standard, format, or software. And that this is because FAIR and FAIRification have been made agnostic to respect the unique requirements and needs of different communities, but that and therefore FAIR can be implemented in different manners and at different levels. However, this flexibility requires careful guidance through the FAIRification process to ensure that the process aligns with the FAIRification objectives. And with that in mind, we developed a Go plan, which is a planning method, is not a verification workflow or a framework. And the method is based on the assumption that distinct objectives can have different impacts on the planning and execution of verification. This method also builds on established methods, other methods from the goal-oriented requirements engineering research area, and also from ontology engineering, like methods such as the use of Go modeling languages such as I*, but also the use of competency questions from ontology engineering. We have validated this method in real-world application, and also more formally, I would say, in 2 tutorials in which we use the technology acceptance model to assess the applicability of the method to the users on practice. And just to give an example, a feedback that we received from one of the participants of these tutorials was that he or she thinks that FAIR is very abstract, and the method helps users identifying the steps towards making FAIR less abstract. And the method creates a good way to argument with project managers and domain experts on why we are doing certain tasks, and therefore it reduces communication issues. The method is also based on the idea that FAIR should be implemented in iterations, and it focuses on, well, we describe these stages, that's how we call it, that goes from the main project to the idealization, verification, preparation, objectives, elicitation, and planning, implementation, assessment, that should go in cycles here. And once the cycles are finished, then we have the project dissemination. The method just focuses on the verification preparation and objectives elicitation and planning stages. And it is organized in 6 phases. So the first 3 phases, which are verification project scoping, assessment of current supporting infrastructure and target resources, and preparation of project collaboration, are related to the preparation stage. And the phase is identification of the main scope and reuse stakeholders, refinement of verification goals, and alignment with FAIR principles and decision-making are related to the verification objectives, elicitation, and planning stage. For the sake of time, I don't have time to explain each of the phases, but I wanted to exemplify phase 4. So all phases are further described in steps. And phase 4 focuses on identifying the domain scope and also identifying reuse stakeholders. So it starts by identifying and refining the domain scope by, for example, descriptions of the domain or mind maps and slides. And it uses the description of the domain to identify and refine semantic types, which are like the main elements of scope. For example, in a case of rare diseases, it will the semantic types will be like the patient, disease, diagnose, genotype, phenotype, etc. And then it uses these semantic types, which are then validated with domain experts, to identify and refine possible reuse stakeholders. And we focus on this because we assume that reusability is the ultimate goal of FAIR, and therefore you must identify some possible reuse scenarios of your FAIR data. So you prepare it for some use cases. This is an example of the real world use case that is also described in the paper FAIR Catalog of Ontology-Driven Conceptual Models. And one example is that by defining very detailed verification objectives, we were able to define more precise achievement criteria for principles that lack some more objective achievement criteria. For example, principle R1 says that metadata are richly described with a plurality of accurate and relevant attributes, but richly is a bit vague, I would say. So by defining how, for example, a newcomer to the catalog would reuse the data, we were able to define which metadata concepts should be collected to make the data rich enough. We also used in another use case in which we defined very clear objectives to define the scope of a model that we wanted to refine, I mean, a data model. And this helped the communication between the domain experts, the ontologists, and the domain and the FAIR experts. And we managed to refine a model that looked like this, like a few concepts, a lot of relationships overwhelming the model, to a model that looked like this. So the objectives also helped model refinement. That is basically it. I have a limited time. I just wanted to conclude with this saying that a problem well put is half solved, and we think that refining the objectives is also a way to put problems well. And you find the paper that describes the method in this link. That's
Fantastic.
it. Thank you.
Thanks you so much, Cesar. I think we're a little bit lacking or after the schedule, but I think that's fine. So just keeping people reassured. Now the next speaker is Keith Russell, according to the schedule. If you're ready to share your slide, that would be fantastic.
Yep, thanks, Volmar. Slideshow. There we are. Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. Lovely to hear all these developments and all the verification processes and practices happening. For me, this feels a little bit like a step back to the good old basics of the FAIR data or the FAIR guiding principles. So my name's Keith Russell. I'm Director of Outreach at the Australian Research Data Commons, but I'm especially here because I'm a co-chair of the RDA FAIR Data Maturity Model Working Group. And my fellow co-chairs, which I would like to mention for all the work and effort they put into it, are Shelley Stahl, Edith Herzog, and also Anasuria Devaraji. So the working group, why were we set up? Well, the FAIR guiding principles were, of course, published, and there was a lot of enthusiasm around them back in the day. But when they were published, it was sort of clear that the principles were not very strict. There was a lot of ambiguity around that, and Cesar already mentioned a few of those the bits of ambiguity that were coming out of the guiding principles. And a lot of organizations at that time were setting up different FAIR assessment frameworks. And those were resulting in different metrics. It was very hard to compare those results. There was no standard way of looking at them. So what we said is, would it not be a good idea to see if we could come up a core set of assessment criteria for what fairness might look like and develop a FAIR data maturity model? So that was the whole thinking behind the working group back in 2019. So that's a few years back now. We were not intended to set up a new evaluation method or to define how the core criteria would need to be evaluated. And we definitely did not want to redesign the FAIR principles. So we were established back in 2019, and first of all, we did a bit of a landscaping report to find out what already existed, and came up, and then we started consulting with the community to find out what should be in the model, what should those indicators be that should be in the actual FAIR self-assessment tool. So that ended up resulting in a published model, and from then onwards we went into maintenance mode. So the FAIR data maturity model specification and guidelines were published back in 2020 with a very simple Excel sheet to go alongside it with little pretty bars that gave you an idea how well you scored on findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. It's been accessed lots of times since then, and it's even been translated into German. So you can also find it in German if you want to. And the question was, what are some lessons learned that we've run into over the years since then? So first of all, it was hard to keep track of all of the different adoptions of the FAIR data maturity model. We found at least 20, but we are quite sure there's more. It was great to hear about the work Nikki's been doing. Sounds like that's yet another great example of the use of this. And we have run, as we've been in maintenance mode, run several sessions sharing lessons learned of what it's been like to use the model and what's come out of that. What we've especially learned in that process is that there's very varying levels of maturity across communities. It really depends on what sort of research community you're talking to, where they're at in being able to address FAIR. Very varied adoptions depending on community needs and especially technologies. In some fields, people are much more advanced. There's much more agreement within the community, what the standards are, what the formats are, what the vocabularies or ontologies are. In other areas, that's still much less mature and there's much more work to be done. If you look at the letters, obviously interoperability is the hardest and requires that discipline agreed standards and questions around who sets the standards, how do you actually document those, how do you agree those, what are the vocabularies, how do you agree those, how do you set up qualified references. So I think those were probably a few of the key lessons we've run into in the process of looking at the adoptions and working through those adoptions. One of the other things we also ran into is that FAIR goes so far, but there are a number of other things that come alongside it that are intentionally not covered in the FAIR principles, and that makes perfect sense. But you do get overlap points and connection points. One of those is the care principles, and how do FAIR and care intersect? Another example is data preservation, and what does it mean to decide to keep data? And if you're preparing data to be FAIR, how long will it actually be FAIR, and how long are you going to keep that data and make it available, reusable? So those were just a few things that came out of this. So if you want to learn more, please go to have a look at the model and join the working group or have a read on the article in data science. And I cannot, and hopefully Jeff will smile about this one. It's in his backyard. This is the next our Research Data Alliance plenary is going to be in Brisbane in Jeff's backyard. And please come, it will be wonderful to see you there and enjoy a conversation in real life. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Keith. Next up is Simon. And please do remember to add some questions to the chat or to the Q&A. There will be an open discussion after this, so also keep that in mind. Simon?
Hi, Wilma. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak. I'm going to talk about two things that came out of the World FAIR project. One is FAIR implementation profiles. So I need to clarify, they didn't come out of the World FAIR project, but we used them in the World FAIR project, and I'll talk about our experience of using them, which I think is very relevant to these discussions. And secondly, the cross-domain interoperability framework, which was a product of the World FAIR project and is now going forward in a set of parallel projects under the umbrella of something we call World FAIR Plus, because it's a continuation, but those projects have many different funders. So I'm speaking as the Executive Director of CODATA. CODATA is the Committee on Data of the International Science Council. We're not just a committee, we're an organization in our own right, and we're a combination between a membership organization that leverages a lot of voluntary activity and an expert secretariat. We do a lot of work in data policy and on technical issues around data to make it fair, data and metadata, I should say, fair. We look at how we can improve the interoperability and reusability in particular of data for any given research domain, and in particular for interdisciplinary research questions and projects. In 2018, we're asked by the International Science Council to prepare a program which we call Making Data Work for Global Grand Challenges, which was really looking at fair implementation and looking at fair implementation for some specific use cases relating to international science. Those use cases are often integration of data in a given research area, or what you might call the combination or integration of data for particular interdisciplinary research projects. That led to the World Fair project, which was funded by the European Commission, but was an international and really a global project because we were allowed to have beneficiaries from all around the world. And then that's leading into a set of work to implement the cross-domain implementation, integration framework, and to explore how we might further extend and refine the CDIF in a set of projects. World Fair itself ran from 2022 to 2024, and we had a set of 11 case studies, and these research areas from all around the world, they're listed there, and the leading organizations are listed there. And the idea was to improve the FAIR practices with our partners in each of those research areas, while also trying to understand how we might improve good practice for the integration of data for interdisciplinary research. And it's that led to the cross-domain interoperability framework. We had a methodology which involved using FAIR implementation profiles to better understand the current and potential practice in each of those research disciplines. We then ran a set of workshops as a project, but also with particular case studies to share our ideas and to get feedback on our ideas for the CDIF, for the cross-domain interoperability framework, and then the output of the World Fair project with these recommendations for each of those research areas and some very practical recommendations, as well as the CDIF itself. So that's the context, and now I'll talk about FAIR implementation profiles. They're a methodology developed by the Go FAIR initiative, and really they're a very simple and brilliant idea. Many brilliant ideas are incredibly simple. It's essentially a questionnaire, a set of questions. How do you as a discipline or as a community or as a repository even respond to the FAIR principles? How do you put them into practice? And so it becomes a very good exercise for reflecting on the FAIR principles, but in particular for identifying specifically how you can respond to them. And that how is very important. I'll go on to discuss that later. We report on our experience of using the FAIR implementation profiles in a report. There's an output of the project. And we also reflect on that. We did a landscape survey of FAIR assessment, and we reflected on our experience with FIPS, with FAIR implementation profiles, and made recommendations for FAIR assessment as well. In sum, we feel that FIPS are a very good conversation starter, a very good workshop exercise to get our colleagues thinking about the FAIR principles. They also have potentially a hugely important role in aggregating information about FAIR practices. However, in our report, we make some recommendations about the technical underpinnings of the current FAIR infrastructure, but we will carry on engaging with Go FAIR and engaging with the FIPS process in our work going forward, because we think it's very valuable. In that report on FAIR assessment, we did reflect on a lot of the practice around FAIR assessment and looked a lot of the tools and articles that have been published about it. One of the things recently I said, this is a year and a half old now, but Michel Scoop in an event in Vienna said that we now have so many FAIR assessment tools, we're going to need a tool to assess them. And we agree with that sort of slight concern about the amount of activity around FAIR assessment as opposed to FAIR implementation. And coming back to what I said about how, a lot of the FAIR assessment tools are very useful, again, to encourage reflection of users on how we implement the FAIR, of what we do, but they're deliberately non-prescriptive. That's fine. But we found with our case studies that a lot of what was really useful is to know, well, what FAIR enabling resource, to use that terminology, what FAIR enabling resource is being used. So FIPS asked precisely that. What ontology or metadata schema or whatever it is are you using to respond to the FAIR principles? So we have a shift from whether the FAIR principle is being assessed, it's being addressed, to which FAIR enabling resource are you using? And we found furthermore that our case studies wanted guidance on how to implement the FAIR principles, precisely how to put the FAIR enabling resource into practice. So if we think about this ladder of extra guidance, I think we can move from basic FAIR assessment to FAIR implementation profiles to more specific guidance. And this is where the cross-domain interoperability framework comes in. So the seed of the cross-domain interoperability framework is a set of practical guidance, recommendations, and implementation guidance for some specific functional requirements associated with FAIR. Now, to be clear, we don't go through the FAIR principles and say, oh, how do you make things findable, etc. Our concerns are associated with FAIR and dependent upon FAIR, but for some very specific functional requirements and use cases. And I'll go into mention those very shortly. It's categorically not a new standard. It's a set of recommendations and guidance. So here's the cross-domain interoperability framework and the first version of that. We present practical implementation level principles designed to improve data management practice within any given community, but also to enable us to meet specific use cases for aggregation or integration of data within or across domains. It's currently built around 5 profiles, which help address some of these fundamental requirements. But there's further work ongoing, as I mentioned, in those new projects. We talk about discovery, and we present a discovery profile about access. So FAIR is not about open, but is about declaring the precise terms on which access is possible or enabled. We make recommendations about good use of controlled vocabularies and how to describe them, and in particular on data description for data integration using terminologies, mappings, and data description using DDI, CDI. We also make recommendations around universals, time, geography, units of measure, and a number of widely used terminologies, because they're often linkages between specific data sets. We've had very good feedback. It is a large document which we've turned into a web resource called the CDIF book. But we do think the practical approach that we've taken with a lot of examples and guidance in specific code has been very well received. And there's a nice quote on this slide that we received there, which I won't, in the interest of time, I won't read out, but hopefully that can be taken as an interesting endorsement. In the discovery profile, we present a content model, make recommendations about particular fields for discovery. We recommend using schema.org with JSON-LD serialization, but we also have a mapping to DCAT, and we describe workflows for publishing. And I think Volmar has put his hand up, so wants me to wind up now. In particular, we recommend surfacing in the discovery profile the particular variables, because they're often used as a key area for, or a key term for which researchers search for to discover the data sets they need. So surface the variables in discovery. Here's a slide on the data integration using the variable, cascade, and DDI, CDI, and structural description, which is a key part of CDIF. And this indicates our work program going forward and the additional profiles which are being prepared for the cross-domain interoperability framework, and a list of outputs from the World Fair project. And I will end with the plug for International Data Week. Volmar, back to you.
All right, thank you. So three very interesting perspectives of different solutions and approaches to implementing the FAIR principles. The links to Simon's slides are available in the meeting notes if you want to follow up on some of the links. And I do have a few questions on the Mentimeter, so I'm going to switch over to that window now briefly. And I think this can kickstart the discussion with us. So, I mean, if you have something that you would like to highlight, then please also feel free to raise your hand and comment. There is one question here, which I added, which is, I mean, do you think that this topic is settled, or is there more to do in the RDA or outside of it? And this is in reference to the process for making stuff fair. And I mean, some of this is not really new things. It's been tested and iterated on over many different projects. And Simon mentioned one of them. Cesar also mentioned that, I mean, he had a reference to the work that Vasilios presented, and there's also a link between Nikki's activities and the ones that Vasilios presented, and then also the RDA work on the maturity model for FAIR data. So, I mean, it's in some terms already a mature discussion, and the question is, like, where do we go from here? And there are some ongoing activities where we're kind of collecting experiences from implementing, I mean, using the maturity assessment, and then also using some of the approaches from GoFair and I mean the related emerging technological frameworks. So is there something we can do from here? And I'll put this question out here for the speakers, but also for anyone in the audience to comment. And if you feel uncomfortable speaking up, then you can always put something in the chat and I will highlight it. So anyone from the speakers who would like to comment on this? Maybe Keith, since you are have been stewarding this topic for quite a while, at least with regards to the maturity model.
Thanks, Volmar. So I think it's a really good question. When we started the process and started looking at FAIR assessment, that was early days, and there was some FAIR assessment out there. I think there are now plenty of FAIR assessment frameworks. I completely agree with that. And I don't think we need yet another FAIR assessment framework. As we were going through the process of writing up the FAIR data maturity model, one of the suggestions was, what about an implementation maturity model? And it's great to see that we did not deliver that. We looked at it and we said we could do it, but that's a huge job, and that would be another extra step. And it's great to see that a few years on, people have started developing that. And I've seen a whole bunch of things here this evening that I want to dig in a bit deeper, because I think they're really helpful. And I think what we're also seeing is that some of the gaps that in the adoptions, the questions we were getting back during those adoptions are now starting to be tackled. So, for example, that question around interoperability, what does interoperability actually look like? I think FIPS are a very useful step in the process, and the cross-domain interoperability framework, so the work that Simon presented. So I think what you're seeing is that the sector is moving on, and please don't get stuck on things that have, please don't reinvent things that have already been invented, but please look at that evolving landscape and these tools that have now come up and have been developed. So I'm really impressed to hear of all the next steps around FAIRification that have been set up. I've not tried them all out, so I can't say that they're perfect or they'll do the trick perfectly. But I think what we're seeing is that the sector is moving along, and then I think the communities will now need to start using these tools and start adopting these. So anyway, just a few reflections from my side.
Yeah, thank you. And I see that you still have sessions presenting some of the emerging work on assessments as well. So, I mean, the working group is still, in a sense, kind of going strong. Any comments from the other speakers on, I mean, potential next steps related to this? I pasted some honorable mentions in the chat now for some examples of approaches that unfortunately could not be presented here during the session today. And one of them is the FAIR Metro line, which is a news item, basically asking for input and working together on describing processes for how to approach making or taking the steps on the FAIR journey. So if you have anything that you would like to share, some developments either inside of the RDA or outside of the RDA, please feel free to add those to the collaborative notes or speak up here as well. So unless there's anyone who really wants to grab this question, I'll move on to the next one. There is another one that got a upvote, which is in the context of life sciences, are there particular barriers or complexities that make it more difficult to make data assets and services fairer? And I guess that's more taking a step towards a higher degree of fair. Nikki.
Thanks. So yeah, I mean, this is something we come across quite often. Obviously in the health sciences, we have the issue of working with human data. So something can, never be completely open. But the barriers that we are coming across are really about, so number one is knowledge. And these are some of the challenges I'd already mentioned in my talk is your average scientist who's working at the bench does not necessarily know about FAIR and have the resources to make things fair. And that's the other point is it actually requires quite a lot of effort and resources to go fair. It requires data curation and it requires a sort of a set of skills and time. So I think those are the major barriers that we've come across, the not being able to share human data, having the knowledge about what is fair, and then thirdly, having the resources and the time and effort and, the will to go fair.
I think that's a very good point. I mean, FAIR doesn't need to be open, perhaps, and also making sure that people really understand what it means to go all the way through FAIR. And Vasilios, you also alluded to that. I mean, from the experience of the FAIR Plus project, there weren't really any projects that did go all the way up, right?
Well, just to add on what Nikki said, well, data accessibility, that's the first thing. So how would you access the data? Because there may be legal, well, you talked about health data, which is one example. The other one is, well, industry is involved. Maybe they don't, well, not maybe, usually they are not sharing their data easily. But on the other end, industry, they have the resources actually. So if they are committed to do FAIR, they can do so. In the academic world, it's more like, well, it's like the guiding principles, you should do FAIR, but there are hardly any resources. I mean, yes, there is training there, but the incentive is maybe not sufficient to provide resources, as you said, to the researchers, to the lab researchers, to this whole ecosystem. And everything now, it's the impression that we have sometimes that relies on the goodwill and effort of like volunteers, us, RDA being other Elixir and other communities. Well, it's not a complexity. It's really something that we could change if there were more commitments from the founders or from the institutions themselves.
Very good comment. Maybe we need more industry actors also involved in joining sessions like this in the RDA, or we could find a forum where we can kind of link and bring these discussions forward. And I think there are a few of those, like the Pistoia Alliance, which if you look at the example from Philip Rocasera, who couldn't join us today, the FAIR Maturity Matrix, and also I think some parts of the FAIR Plus project's legacy also lives on in the Pistoia Alliance. So I think these are good developments. There might be similar things going on in the Go Fair Foundation as well, popping up more regionally. So we should keep an eye on those. There's one more that got some upvotes here. So for cross-domain fair, at what level is it realistic to agree to or harmonize, e.g. from principles to guidelines to technical specifications and validation checks? And I think this ties a little bit into the CDIF, where you have technical specifications, and Simon has his hand up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'd like to jump on that one, obviously. I mean, this is in our wheelhouse, and this is what we're concerned about. So the term realistic, I would also argue, I would argue, yes, it is realistic, and it's also necessary. I mean, we start our work from the premise that a lot of really important research to address fundamental issues of the planet and society are inherently interdisciplinary. And if we don't start figuring out how we address issues of data reuse and data integration for those interdisciplinary research projects, then we've got a big responsibility to do that. I'm not going to say it's easy, obviously. Within any given research domain, there are debates about terminologies and ontologies and how we align them. But perhaps if I can share a slide, I can I can point to two of the projects that we've been involved with related to World Fair, where we work across domains. So World Fair Work Package 7, related to a set of population health and clinical data integration in the context of a series of projects in Eastern Africa. They combine large level population health data, so health data, health and demographic social survey surveillance centers data with clinical data. And in some instances, phylogenetic data, but also with contextual environmental data as well. Now that involves two, I'm simplifying slightly, but two really important steps. One is the combination of data by various means. That involves understanding the structure, it involves understanding time and geography, and the semantic work of aligning the, various terminologies. Now, again, I'm not saying that that's easy, but it is possible. It is possible to understand those data sets, to describe their structure, to break them apart and put them back together, often using time and geography or time and location. And it is possible to do the hard work of aligning the terminologies. And there's a lot of work going on in the OMOP community and in that project to do that semantic mapping. Another example is the EOS Future project, Climate Neutral and Smart Cities, with a similar approach. How do you combine a social survey, which asks questions about citizens' attitudes to climate change and pollution, with our data for the real experience, as it were, of that climate change and pollution? So it's a combined data set, which is fundamental to a key research question. And the task is to take the relevant questions and variables in the European Social Survey and combine them geographically and in time with the data from the various remote sensing and other sources for climate change and pollution. Yeah. It involves a lot of work around the definitions of space, but it also involves combining a set of variables so that they can be queried by researchers, and in particular demonstrating the data combination pipeline, which is the diagram that's there on the screen, and that makes it more repeatable year on year and reproducible.
So thank you for that. I think this is a really good illustration of, I mean, if you're making some concrete examples of goals that you would like to achieve. I mean, like these use cases from the World Fair projects, you can find these examples of commonalities where, I mean, you can make a case for going all the way down to the technical specifications and having the recommendations support certain types of queries and data integrations across larger or across disciplines. I think we have only 5 minutes left of the meeting, so it's about time to wrap up. I'm just going to look through what the rest of the questions on the Q&A are for now, and then maybe we can get back to some of them in the finalization of the meeting notes. I'm going to go back to the recording and add some I mean, summaries of the different approaches. And I also invite everyone to collaborate and contribute examples of approaches that might not have been covered in the presentation slides or in the discussions, so we can get a good understanding of the current state of the art. So the questions that are outstanding here is, for example, to what degree is licensing an issue with FAIR? Questions triggered by a vague memory of REDCap approach, and then a link here. And I think that might have been addressed to some degree. I'm going to leave it unanswered though, so we can go back to that in the email thread as we reach out to the participant who share their contact information. There was one question here on how do you define a service? Maybe I did not understand. It's different from workflow. I think this is something that was mentioned in one of the presentations. So, I mean, what did we mean there? And are there different characteristics of types of services that we imagine could be made more fair? So maybe that is something the speaker could then help elaborate a little bit on in the notes. And then with all these great efforts to make data and tools fair, are there examples of routine accompanying effort to determine how the outputs are being reused? What's the return on investment? And I think this is a good question that, I mean, also ties into appropriate goal setting, and I mean, maybe including then the follow-up steps in that procedure. So I think maybe Jeff, that was your question. So
that was my question, and I'll just say, I guess I was sort of echoing Nick. He said, you know, that this is a lot of researchers don't know about FAIR, and I think us as data managers often go to a lot of effort to do this. And I think I'm just interested in, and again, I want to frame it that I'm a great proponent of fairness, but is there a routine? Does anyone routinely look at, you know, the value and the reuse of the resources that we are going to great effort to make fair? Because, you know, it's a lot of effort, and is it, you know, I'm just putting it out there, is it worth that amount of effort? So I think it's just something we need to be cognizant of.
Yeah, and that's a good concluding remark, perhaps. I mean, remember that we have these collaborative notes. These are going to turn into a short report on this topic. And I think, I mean, a call to action here would be, I mean, consider, are there collaborations that you would like to pursue with some of the speakers or other people who joined the conversation or the meeting today? And then we can perhaps form some form of informal group to have some discussions on where it would make sense for us to collaborate, either within the RDA or in some other venue. I mean, one option could be to propose a birds of a feather session sometime down the line at the future plenary to discuss, I mean, the FAIRification processes and support for those processes, and perhaps also, I mean, I mean, business value or return on investment of doing all this work. Any concluding remarks from the co-chairs, Jeff or Nikki?
No, just from my side, thank you very much for everybody participating, and we look forward to your participation and your contributions to the document.
Yeah, same here. Thanks, everyone. These are never long enough. So anyway, we just got started. We shall continue the conversation either online at IWWI International Data Week. Come to Brisbane, please. See you at one of those.
All right, so we have 1 minute to spare. Any last word from one of the speakers or someone else just saying goodbye? Then we'll wrap up.
Maybe I would like to support Jeff's last question, because I think it's linked also to what I mentioned before, the resources that are provided to the research community to do this fair. because for now it's only seen as a burden. It's time consuming, it costs money, and there are no such really incentives, and then we don't see the real value. So okay, we did all that. Why for? How is it used? How are we valued when we do FAIR? Do we have an advantage on others, or are we supported more because we do that? So that needs to be also well, at least discussed and see how we can do better on that topic too.
Perfect. So there are plenty of discussions to be had following this, and all of those of you who shared your contact information will get a follow-up email after this. So thanks a lot, and looking forward to interacting with you at the plenary over the next few days. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.